Hey guys, tonight we're taking a leisurely, very sleepy stroll back in time to 18th century London. Now, imagine a city alive with 1,000 sounds and smells: the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares, the distant murmur of the Thames, and a truly impressive blend of coal smoke, sewage, and roasting meat. It's a vibrant, chaotic, utterly enthralling place. But here's the kicker: as you navigate its bustling streets, you keep instinctively reaching for your pocket, perhaps to check your phone for the time, only to find nothing. Because in this London, before ubiquitous public clocks, before synchronized time, and certainly before anyone ever thought to invent a little vibrating rectangle that lived in your pocket, telling the exact hour was, shall we say, a bit of an interpretive dance. You probably wouldn't survive this, not without missing every appointment you ever made. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are in the world, and what time it is, down in the comments. It's always fun to see how far these sleepy whispers travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a narrow, bustling London street, perhaps near Cheapside or Fleet Street. The air is thick with the scent of humanity, horses, and open drains, punctuated by the sweet aroma of fresh-baked bread from a nearby bakery. You dodge a porter's laden shoulders, sidestep a puddle of questionable origin, and narrowly avoid being run over by a carriage that clearly prioritizes speed over pedestrian safety. This is a city of explosive growth, a swirling vortex of commerce, culture, and social stratification. Mainstream historical fact: 18th century London was a rapidly growing metropolis, already one of the largest cities in the world, serving as a hub of global trade and cultural exchange. Yet it fundamentally lacked the standardized and easily accessible timekeeping we take for granted today. Forget setting your watch to an atomic clock. Most people didn't even have a watch to set. Imagine the sheer confusion, the logistical nightmare of trying to coordinate anything. Meet me at 2 o'clock, you might say to a friend. But 2 o'clock? By whose reckoning the sun is peeking through the smog-laden sky? But is it exactly 2? What if it's cloudy? What if your friend lives on the other side of town, where their local church bell might ring slightly differently? It's like trying to plan a group project where everyone's clock is off by 5 to 15 minutes, and half the group are still using sundials. Good luck with that deadline. The absence of widespread synchronized public clocks meant that time wasn't a universal, precise measurement. It was localized, approximate, and often subject to interpretation. You couldn't glance up at Big Ben because Big Ben wouldn't be built for another century. You couldn't check your phone because your phone wouldn't be invented for another 2 centuries, and it definitely wouldn't survive the London smog. So how did this massive, bustling city manage to function? How did merchants open their shops? Courts convene, markets buzz, and plays begin without a universally agreed-upon hour? This is the delightful, often surprisingly unboring mystery we're easing into tonight. The chaotic symphony of 18th century London is a key part of this temporal puzzle. The quirky tidbit here is that the city's overwhelming sensory experience, the constant cacophony of street cries, rattling carts, church bells, and human chatter would make precise acoustic time signals difficult to discern for many. You couldn't just rely on hearing the nearest bell, because 10 other bells might be ringing, plus a fruit seller yelling about fresh apples, and a chimney sweep loudly proclaiming his services. It was a constant sensory assault, making the subtle tick-tock of a clock largely irrelevant unless it was right under your nose. So you had to learn to tell time by other, more visceral means, or just accept that around midday was as good as it was going to get. You might be thinking, well, they must have had some way to tell the time. Right? What about the sun? And yes, you're absolutely right. The sun was indeed the oldest and most reliable clock, but it came with its own set of seasonal and meteorological challenges. But we'll get to that. The point is the very concept of standardized time, of everyone knowing exactly the same hour and minute, was a luxury that most Londoners simply didn't have. It was a more fluid, organic way of living, where punctuality was less about being on the dot and more about showing up when you could. Historians still debate the true level of daily inconvenience caused by this lack of precise time synchronization. Was it a constant source of missed appointments and frustrating delays? Or did society simply adapt to a less rigid schedule? Perhaps people simply allowed for greater margins. Assuming a meeting at 10 meant any time between 9:30 and 11, it's a fascinating thought experiment. If your day wasn't dictated by precise minutes and seconds, how would your perception of time, and indeed your life, fundamentally change? Would you be less stressed, more relaxed, or just eternally late for everything tonight? As we drift deeper into this historical puzzle, we'll explore the ingenious, often humorous, ways Londoners kept track of time when the clock on the lamppost simply didn't exist. So, you're in 18th century London, utterly lost in time because your phone has yet to be invented and there isn't a digital clock in sight. Where do you look first? Well, if the sun decided to make a rare appearance through the famous London smog, your gaze would probably drift towards the most ancient and visually prominent time-telling device available, the sundial. These weren't just quaint garden ornaments back then. They were functional, essential, and sometimes incredibly frustrating pieces of public infrastructure. You'd find them everywhere the sun could reach, etched into the walls of grand public buildings, standing proudly in churchyards, sometimes even painted directly onto the side of a merchant's shop. A sundial is gloriously simple. Right mainstream historical fact. Sundials are among the earliest and most widespread timekeeping devices, relying on the sun's apparent movement across the sky to cast a shadow from a fixed object, called a gnomon, onto a marked surface. Its elegantly intuitive long shadow means early morning or late afternoon. Short shadow means midday, simple, effective, and beautifully analog. It's like the original glance and go timekeeping system. Only the glance part had to be timed just right, and the go part might be a bit of a guess. You can imagine standing there, craning your neck, squinting up at a gnomon, trying to decipher the exact minute from a shadow that seems to be inching along with the pace of a very tired snail. It's like trying to figure out the exact time on a clock, where all the numbers are smudged and the hands are constantly wobbling. But the beauty of a sundial was its direct connection to the cosmic rhythm. It truly measured solar time, the time according to the sun's actual position in the sky. But here's where London, with its notoriously fickle weather, threw a giant, gray, rain-soaked wrench into the works. What good is a sundial when the sun is playing hide-and-seek behind a thick blanket of clouds, or when the famous London fog rolls in, dense enough to cut with a knife? A sundial in London was like a fair-weather friend, perfectly reliable when conditions were optimal, utterly useless the moment a single cloud decided to block its view. You might try to squint through the drizzle, hoping for a glimmer, but all you'd get is a damp face and a vague sense of existential dread about how late you might be. Then there's the delightful complication of the equation of time. This is where our quirky tidbit comes in. Because the Earth's orbit around the sun isn't a perfect circle, and its axis is tilted, the length of a solar day isn't constant throughout the year. This means that a sundial, which always shows apparent solar time, would constantly be a little bit ahead or a little bit behind the mean solar time that mechanical clocks tried to keep. Sometimes by as much as 16 minutes. Imagine trying to coordinate a tea party or court session when your wall-mounted sundial says 3:15, but by the true average time, it's actually 3:00. Your friend, who might have a slightly less accurate or even a different type of sundial, could be showing up at a completely different 3 o'clock. It's like everyone's smartphone having a slightly different version of reality. But without the option to just Google, what time is it right now? So, while sundials offered a fundamental connection to the daily cycle of light and dark, they were far from precise. They gave you a general sense of morning, midday, or afternoon. But for anything more specific, you were out of luck. You couldn't use a sundial to schedule a dentist appointment for 2:45 p.m., unless you planned on having your dentist also staring at the same patch of wall, hoping for a break in the clouds. This inherent inaccuracy, coupled with the frequent lack of sun, meant that Londoners needed other, more robust, and less weather-dependent ways to keep track of their precious hours. Historians still debate the practical precision with which average Londoners could read and interpret sundials for daily life. Were they really trying to extract minutes, or were they content with broad strokes of time? It's likely that for most, the sundial provided a general orientation within the day, enough to know when to start work, when to break for lunch, and when to start thinking about heading to the alehouse. But for anything that required coordination across the city, or indeed, knowing the exact moment for a momentous occasion, the sundial was simply too unreliable. It was a good start, a solid baseline, but it needed backup, especially when the notorious London fog rolled in and rendered it utterly useless. So as you walk down these bustling streets, you keep glancing up, sometimes at the gnomon on the church, sometimes at the wall of a building, and you see the shadow, or you don't. You get a rough idea, a sense of the sun's slow journey, but you also realize that if you really need to be somewhere on time, you'll need something more than just a clear sky. So the sun, bless its heart, was a bit of a fair weather friend when it came to telling time in 18th century London. You could rely on a sundial about as much as you could rely on a stable Wi-Fi connection during a thunderstorm. But if the sun was hiding, or if it was the middle of the night, where did Londoners turn? They looked to the heavens. Yes, but more practically, they listened. They listened for the resounding, often cacophonous, symphony of the city's many church bells. You see, London wasn't just a sprawling metropolis. It was a city dotted with hundreds of churches, each with its own towering steeple and, crucially, its own set of bells. These weren't just for calling the faithful to prayer on Sundays. They were the heartbeat of daily life, the loudest and most far-reaching time signals available to the common Londoner. Mainstream historical fact. Before the widespread adoption of accurate and accessible mechanical clocks, church bells served as the primary public timekeeping mechanism in virtually all European cities. They broadcasted the hours, often the quarter hours, and sometimes even shorter intervals across the urban landscape, cutting through the din of carts, cries, and commerce. Imagine a typical London morning. You wake to the gentle rumble of distant traffic and the persistent damp chill in the air. You stretch, grab a crust of bread, and then you hear a booming chime, perhaps one, two, or three times, echoing from the steeple down the street. That was your signal. That was how you knew. Roughly at what time it was. It might be St. Paul's bell ringing its grand tenor, or a smaller parish church just around the corner letting out a more modest peal. These weren't just sounds, they were moments, markers in the day's unfolding drama. But here's where the charming, chaotic reality of 18th century timekeeping really shines through. While these bells were ubiquitous, they were far from synchronized. Each church's bell was regulated by its own internal master clock, which might have been a simple sandglass, a water clock, or an early, often temperamental, mechanical clock that needed constant winding and adjustment. The result, a delightful, if bewildering, temporal jumble. You might hear the bell from St. Clement Danes strike 7, only to hear the bell from St. Mary Le Bow chime 7 minutes later, followed by another church half a mile away, ringing its own slightly off-kilter version of 7 a few minutes after that. It was like living in a city where everyone's phone vibrated at a slightly different time for the same incoming message. Did that just say 7 a.m., or was that the bell for your almost late, lazy bones? This out-of-sync cacophony is a fantastic, quirky tidbit about daily life. Londoners had to develop a finely tuned ear for their local bell, learning to trust the sound of their parish church over the distant clang of another. You wouldn't just know it's 7 o'clock. You'd know it's 7 o'clock by St. Margaret's bell, which might be entirely different from 7 o'clock by St. Giles' bell. It created a series of localized time bubbles where punctuality was less about a universal standard and more about a shared understanding within a certain district. It's like a quaint historical version of everyone having their own time zone within the same city. The sound of the bells permeated everything. It was the rhythm of the city. The watchmen calling out the hour, the market traders beginning their day, the taverns opening their doors, all regulated by the booming, metallic voice of the church. But precision was a luxury. You knew it was around 3 or about 8, but exact minutes and seconds, forget about it. The bells might strike the hour, but they rarely provided the kind of granular detail we crave today. And like sundials, bells were also subject to the whims of the London weather. A strong wind could carry the sound away from your neighborhood, or a particularly dense fog could muffle it into an indistinguishable thrum, leaving you once again adrift in a sea of temporal ambiguity. Historians still debate the degree to which Londoners perceived these bell variations as inconvenient or simply as part of the city's natural temporal rhythm. Did it cause widespread frustration and missed connections? Or did society simply adapt to a more fluid, approximate sense of time? It's likely that for most, it was just the way things were. Punctuality was a relative concept, and on time meant within a reasonable window. You simply built in a buffer, expecting that your meeting at 2 bells might actually happen anywhere between 1:55 and 2:15, depending on which bell you listened to and how fast you walked. It was a fascinating, often charmingly inefficient system. But for 18th century London, it was the best public clock they had. So the sun could be a no-show, and church bells, while wonderfully noisy, were often playing their own unique, unsynchronized symphony. How did Londoners get even a vague sense of the hour when the weather was foul or the specific chimes of their local steeple just weren't clear? Well, you didn't have to look up or even just listen to the bells. Sometimes time came directly to you, heralded by a very human voice echoing through the narrow, lamp-lit streets the watchman or bellman. Imagine the scene, it's dark, perhaps late at night, and the usual daytime cacophony of London has quieted to a more subdued murmur. The only sounds are the distant clatter of hooves, the soft rush of the river, and the occasional drunken shout from a tavern. Then, from the inky shadows, you hear it? A voice often gruff from years of shouting into the cold night air, calling out. Mainstream historical fact night watchmen in 18th century London, beyond their duties of patrolling the streets for criminals and fires, were also responsible for announcing the time and weather conditions. They were essentially human alarm clocks and local weather forecasts rolled into one, though perhaps not always reliably. The watchman's cry was a rhythmic ritual. As he trudged along his appointed beat, lantern swinging, staff thumping on the cobblestones, he'd periodically halt, clear his throat, and bellow the hour. Past 2 o'clock and a cloudy morning, he might bellow, or 12:30, and all's well. He'd often accompany this with the clang of a small bell or a rattle to ensure his pronouncements cut through the remaining urban hum. It was a remarkably low-tech, yet effective way to disseminate information, especially when you didn't have Twitter or even a postal service that ran hourly updates. You'd probably learn to recognize the particular timbre of your local watchman's voice, associating it with the passing hours. It was a comforting sound for some, a regular beat in the unpredictable rhythm of city life. For others, particularly those trying to sleep, it was probably an annoying intrusion. Oh, bless him, it's 3 a.m. already. I thought I heard him shout that half an hour ago. You might grumble, pulling your blanket tighter. It's like having a very slow, very vocal smart speaker that only tells you the time and the weather, and occasionally complains about his aching feet. The watchmen themselves would have primarily relied on the church bells to tell their own time, or perhaps a rough pocket watch if they were lucky enough to possess one. So their accuracy was, by extension, dependent on the accuracy of those very bells which, as we know, varied wildly. This created a chain of temporal approximation. The church bell was approximate. and the watchman's announcement of it was therefore also approximate. It's like your friend texting you the time, but their phone is stuck on 10 minutes in the past. The quirky tidbit about these watchmen is how often they were parodied and sometimes reviled. They were frequently depicted in popular culture as being old, sleepy, inefficient, and sometimes even drunk. They were easy targets for pranksters and robbers alike, not exactly the intimidating figures of law and order you might envision. Past 3 o'clock, and all's hiccup. Well, mostly, you might imagine a particularly jolly watchman slurring. This widespread perception meant their pronouncements, while generally useful, might also have been taken with a grain of salt or a pinch of dubious laughter. They were more a general reassurance than a precision time service. Despite their shortcomings, the watchmen were an invaluable part of the city's temporal landscape. They provided a consistent, human-delivered time signal that no sundial could offer at night or in bad weather. Their presence also offered a degree of security, or at least the illusion of it, simply by making their rounds and loudly proclaiming the hour. In a world without streetlights on every corner, the flickering glow of their lanterns and the sound of their voices were anchors in the dark. Historians still debate the true level of accuracy and synchronization achieved by these human time announcers across various London parishes. While they were meant to be reliable, the individual watchman's diligence, his own internal clock, and the varying accuracy of the bells he listened to would have created a mosaic of slightly different official times across the city. So, if you had an urgent meeting, you'd better hope your watchman and your acquaintance's watchman were listening to the same bell and had both recently had a strong cup of coffee. The human voice, while immediate, carried its own unique imprecision, adding another layer to the wonderfully fuzzy timekeeping of 18th century London. So far, we've explored the grand, public ways Londoners tried to wrangle time the sun, the bells, and even the sleepy shouts of the watchman. But what if you were a bit more well-to-do? What if you wanted your timekeeping to be a little more personal, a little less dependent on whether the sun was shining or if the nearest bell ringer was still awake? This is where we step into the exclusive, glittering world of the 18th century gentleman and his ultimate accessory, the pocket watch. You, perhaps a wealthy merchant or a prosperous barrister, wouldn't be caught dead asking a street vendor for the time. No. Your time was far too valuable for such common indignities. You needed something that whispered of sophistication, of status, and of a subtle, if often inaccurate, control over the fleeting moments of your day. Mainstream historical fact, early pocket watches were incredibly expensive luxury items, accessible only to the wealthiest elite. Owning one was a clear declaration of your social standing, far more than just a tool for punctuality. It was a piece of wearable art, a miniature marvel of engineering and craftsmanship tucked discreetly into your waistcoat pocket. Imagine the feel of it, a smooth, cool disc of polished gold or silver, intricately engraved, perhaps adorned with delicate enamel work or even tiny precious stones. You'd pull it out with a flourish, the glint catching the candlelight, the delicate chain catching the eye. The face might be hand-painted with Roman numerals and elegant, spindly hands, all behind a convex glass. You'd press a small button, and the cover would snap open with a satisfying click, revealing the tiny, intricate world within. It was a marvel, a true conversation starter, and an undeniable flex for your 18th century social circle. Oh, is that the time, my dear? You're looking at a year's wages for a common laborer. Right here in my hand. It was like having a luxury car, but it was also a timepiece that might be off by, 20 minutes a day. Because despite their breathtaking beauty and the astonishing skill that went into their creation, early pocket watches were, by modern standards, spectacularly inaccurate. This is our quirky tidbit. Wealthy gentlemen would constantly pull out their watches, snap them open, and consult them with an air of profound seriousness, even though they knew full well the thing was probably gaining or losing minutes by the hour. It was less about true precision and more about the performance of punctuality. It's like checking your phone every 2 minutes, even when you know you have no new notifications, just because it feels right. Their mechanisms were sensitive to temperature changes, the jostling of movement, and even the smallest speck of dust could throw them off. You had to wind them regularly, often daily, a small ritual of temporal maintenance. So, while you might have this exquisite gilded treasure ticking away in your pocket, its primary function was often less about accurate timekeeping and more about projecting an image of a man who dealt with time. A man of importance. You might know it was broadly afternoon from your sundial, or about 3 bells from the church. But when you pulled out your watch, you were demonstrating your personal relationship with the hour. Even if that relationship was a little casual, you couldn't truly rely on it for precise coordination with someone who didn't have a similarly unreliable, equally expensive toy. The ownership of a pocket watch also created a fascinating social stratification of time. While the masses relied on the communal, imprecise rhythms of bells and criers, the elite had their own private, albeit still imprecise, temporal universes. It was a subtle but powerful distinction. You weren't just richer, you were more precisely timed in theory. At least, historians still debate the true social impact of owning a personal timepiece at a time when precision was a luxury. Did it foster a greater sense of punctuality among the elite, or simply provide a prop for their social theater? It's likely a bit of both. It allowed them to interact with a finer grain of time, even if that grain was constantly shifting. It marked them as modern, forward-thinking individuals in a rapidly evolving world, even as they still relied on the old methods to calibrate their new gadgets. So, as our wealthy Londoner taps his pocket, feeling the comforting weight of his prized possession, he's participating in a quiet revolution, a revolution that would slowly, inexorably, begin to pull time away from the sun and the bells and place it, for better or worse, into the hands of individual citizens. A beautiful, flawed, mechanical marvel, ticking away a slightly different version of reality for every gentleman who could afford to call one his own. You've seen the gentleman's prized pocket watch, a personal statement of wealth more than a tool of pinpoint accuracy. But what about the heart of the home if you were a prosperous Londoner? Your personal timekeeping wasn't just confined to your waistcoat. It extended into your very dwelling, anchored by grand, impressive pieces of horology that served as both functional instruments and magnificent statements of domesticity and status. The private home clock. Imagine stepping into a well-appointed London drawing room in the 1700s. The scent of polished wood and perhaps a hint of coal smoke hangs in the air. Sunlight, filtered through heavy curtains, illuminates the intricate patterns on the wallpaper. And there, standing tall and proud in a corner, often a masterpiece of cabinetry and brass, is a long case clock, or as you and I might call it, a grandfather clock, or perhaps a smaller, equally ornate bracket clock resting on a mantelpiece, its face gleaming in the firelight. Mainstream historical fact. The 18th century saw a significant increase in the production and ownership of domestic mechanical clocks, particularly these imposing long case clocks, among the affluent and aspiring middle classes. These were not just practical devices, they were furniture, works of art, and clear indicators of your family's prosperity and good taste. You wouldn't just buy a clock, you'd buy a conversation piece, a focal point, something to show off to your slightly less wealthy cousins. Yes, Giles, that's a new mahogany case. Keeps time marvelously. When I remember to wind it, these clocks, unlike their portable brethren, were heavier, more stable, and could often keep slightly better time, though still not with modern precision. Their mechanisms, powered by weights and pendulums, ticked with a steady, comforting rhythm, and their chimes would boom out the hour, marking the passage of time within the confines of your own four walls. It was a domestic symphony, a constant, gentle reminder of the fleeting nature of hours, minutes and seconds, but mostly just hours. The quirky tidbit here is that having a magnificent clock in your home effectively created your own personal household time zone. While the bells outside might be ringing out of sync and the watchman calling varying hours, your family would live by your clock. It dictated meal times, bedtime for the children, and when the servants started their duties. The master's clock says 6, so 6 it is. Even if St. Bride's is still arguing with St. Paul's, a servant might grumble, rushing to prepare dinner. It made your home a little temporal island, a bastion of self-declared punctuality in a city of temporal chaos. It was like having the only working clock in the house, so everyone just had to listen to you, even if your clock was secretly 5 minutes fast. However, even these impressive domestic timepieces had their limitations. They were still mechanical marvels of their era, prone to gaining or losing time due to changes in temperature, humidity, and the inevitable wear and tear of their intricate gears. They required regular winding, a daily or weekly ritual performed by the master of the house or a trusted servant, ensuring the weights remained elevated and the pendulum swung. Neglect to wind it, and your prestigious status symbol would simply grind to a silent halt, leaving you once again to the mercy of the distant bells or the sun if it cooperated. So, while the family might pride itself on the apparent accuracy of their long case clock, it was still a relative accuracy. There was no direct feed from a national standard, no setting the time by a universally recognized source. Each clockmaker might set their initial timing slightly differently, and each clock would drift at its own unique pace. This meant that while your home might be punctual within itself, coordinating with the wider world still required a degree of flexibility, a mental adjustment to the city's mosaic of local times. Historians still debate the extent to which the proliferation of domestic clocks truly fostered greater punctuality among the gentry, or simply provided a new focal point for household routine and a more refined sense of leisure. Did it make them more efficient, or just more aware of the time they were wasting? Likely, it enabled a shift towards a more organized daily life within the home, providing a consistent reference point for family members and staff. Even if it didn't solve the broader issue of citywide time synchronization, you lean close to the polished wood, listening to the steady, reassuring tick-tock. It's the sound of a private world, measured and controlled, a small victory against the ceaseless flow of unclocked time outside your front door. It's a testament to the growing desire for order and precision, a quiet revolution ticking away in the heart of London homes. Slowly, steadily, moving society towards a future where every minute mattered. You've seen the luxurious pocket watch and the imposing long case clock gracing the homes of London's elite. But how did these marvels of miniature engineering come into existence who spun these intricate webs of brass and steel, turning springs and gears into the very fabric of time? To understand how 18th century Londoners could tell time, even imperfectly, we must delve into the quiet, obsessive world of the watchmaker, a world of unparalleled precision and endless pursuit of accuracy. Imagine stepping off the chaotic, noisy London street and into a watchmaker's workshop. The clamor of the city outside immediately softens, replaced by a delicate, rhythmic symphony, the faint, incessant tick-tock, tick-tock of dozens of mechanisms. The air is still, perhaps carrying a faint scent of fine oil and polished metal. Mainstream historical fact. 18th century watchmaking was a highly skilled craft, combining intricate artistry with cutting-edge precision engineering, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was mechanically possible in timekeeping. These master craftsmen were the high-tech engineers of their day, each piece a testament to meticulous handwork and countless hours of focused labor. You see a craftsman bent over his workbench, eyes narrowed in intense concentration, magnifying glasses perhaps strapped to his forehead or fitted into a special eyepiece. His hands, gnarled and steady, manipulate tiny components with breathtaking dexterity. Each wheel, each pinion, each spring had to be crafted with absolute precision, often by hand, using specialized tools that were themselves works of art. We're talking hundreds of individual parts, each no bigger than a gnat's eyelash, all working in perfect harmony, if they were lucky. It was like building a miniature city where every resident was a tiny whirring gear, and they all had to dance in perfect sync. Good luck getting that done before lunch. The pursuit of accuracy was an obsession. These watchmakers were constantly battling the fundamental enemies of precise timekeeping friction, temperature changes, and gravity. A spring that expanded or contracted with the heat, a tiny speck of dust in the wrong place, or even the slight pull of the earth on a balance wheel could cause a watch to gain or lose precious minutes. They experimented with different materials, refined escapements, the mechanism that regulates the release of energy from the mainspring, and invented clever compensations for thermal expansion. It was a relentless, often frustrating, quest for temporal perfection. The quirky tidbit here is the personality often associated with these master watchmakers. Given the intense focus and unwavering patience required for their trade, they were often stereotyped as being somewhat introverted, meticulous to the point of eccentricity, and utterly obsessed with their craft. You can imagine a watchmaker, hunched over his bench for hours, perhaps muttering to himself about the recalcitrant nature of a particular pivot, while the rest of London rushed by outside. It's not just a hobby, Mildred. It's the relentless pursuit of infinitesimal temporal perfection. They were the kind of people who probably didn't do small talk, but could passionately debate the merits of a particular balance spring design for hours. Becoming a master watchmaker was no easy feat. It involved years of rigorous apprenticeship, often starting as a child, learning the secrets of the trade from a seasoned master. You'd learn to file, to polish, to assemble, to test, and to repair, often working by candlelight late into the night. It was a true passing down of knowledge, honed over generations. These shops were not just places of commerce. They were hubs of innovation, quietly pushing the boundaries of what was mechanically possible. While the pocket watches themselves could be temperamental, the innovations developed in these workshops paved the way for greater accuracy in all mechanical clocks. The precision they achieved, even with the limitations of their materials and understanding, was astounding. It laid the groundwork for the more accurate timepieces that would eventually become widespread and eventually lead to the standardization of time. Historians still debate the extent to which these incremental improvements were driven primarily by abstract scientific theory versus empirical trial and error. Was it brilliant theoretical physicists guiding their hands, or just thousands of hours of skilled craftsmen fiddling with tiny parts until something worked slightly better? Likely, it was a beautiful blend of both a practical hands-on science conducted in dusty, ticking workshops across London. So, as you hear the faint, distant tick of a clock, or even just the quiet hum of your own room, remember these dedicated artisans. They weren't just building clocks, they were building the very framework of modern time. One impossibly small, perfectly crafted gear at a time. Their tireless pursuit of accuracy, often for the enjoyment of a select few, would eventually ripple outwards, transforming not just London, but the world into a place obsessed with punctuality. We've seen how the wealthy Londoners tried to impose a little order on their days with their beautiful, if temperamental, pocket watches and grand household clocks. But what about the vast majority of the city's inhabitants? The street vendors, the laborers, the domestic servants who didn't own a single gear of a watch, let alone a whole grandfather clock for them. Time wasn't some delicate mechanism to be wound or a shadow to be squinted at. For them, time was a far more organic, flexible, and utterly human concept, dictated not by minutes and seconds, but by the relentless rhythm of the city and the simple reality of getting things done. You step out of the quiet watchmaker's shop and into the chaotic, vibrant symphony of the London street market. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, rotting cabbage, horse dung, and a surprising amount of gin. Mainstream historical fact. 18th century London streets were alive with a vibrant array of street vendors, hawking everything from hot cross buns to dust hoe. Their daily routines were largely dictated by the flow of goods, the availability of customers, and consumer demand, rather than precise hourly schedules. For them, time wasn't a clock face. It was a basket full of apples that needed selling before they bruised, or a pile of rags that needed collecting before the dustman arrived. Imagine a fishmonger. He doesn't wake up at 5:00 a.m. because his alarm clock rings. He wakes up when the light begins to filter through his tiny window, knowing the fishing boats will soon be docking at Billingsgate Market with the freshest catch. His day begins when he can acquire his goods, not when a clock dictates. He sells his fish until his basket is empty, or until the sun dips too low and the street lights, what few there were, become too dim. Time for him is the process of transaction, the act of shouting his wares until his throat is sore or his profits are sufficient. It's the ultimate work until it's done schedule, which sounds rather appealing, doesn't it? As long as done means you've made enough money for dinner and a pint. The quirky tidbit here is that the distinctive, often rhyming or musical cries of these various street vendors actually served as informal time markers for many Londoners. You didn't need to hear a bell to know it was approaching midday. You'd know it because you heard the loud, insistent cry of the pudding and pies seller or the milk-o-ye man making his morning rounds. Later in the day, the cries would shift, watercresses, watercresses, in the morning, followed by the cries of cherries ripe but in the afternoon, and finally the haunting call of the charcoal seller as dusk settled. It was a sensory clock, a melodic timetable woven into the very fabric of the city's soundscape. It was like your grandmother always knowing it was dinner time because she heard the exact distant clang of the ice cream truck, even if it was actually just the recycling truck. For these street sellers, appointments were often a foreign concept. If you wanted to buy something specific from a particular vendor, you simply had to be in the right place at the right time, which meant you had to rely on knowing their general habits or simply getting lucky. There were no set business hours beyond the general ebb and flow of daylight and demand. If the weather was bad, or if supply was low, their schedules simply shifted. This wasn't laziness. It was a pure, unmediated response to the immediate conditions of their lives and livelihoods. This flexible, task-based approach to time meant that the strict minutes and seconds that obsessed watchmakers and gentlemen were largely irrelevant for the working classes. Their world operated on broader strokes: morning, market time, dinner time, nightfall. They weren't slaves to the tick-tock of a pendulum. They were masters of their own practical rhythms. If the basket was full, it was early. If the basket was empty, it was late. And if you were still working after dark, well, you were probably just trying to make ends meet. Historians still debate the extent to which this flexible, task-based timekeeping affected overall economic efficiency in London's bustling markets. Did the lack of strict schedules hinder trade, or did it allow for a more adaptable, resilient, and ultimately more human-centric economy? It's likely that it fostered a different kind of efficiency, one based on immediate responsiveness rather than rigid planning. People bought when goods were available and sold when customers were present. It was a more fluid dance between supply and demand, where time was less a ruler and more a gentle guide. So, as you wander these historical streets, let your ears guide you. Don't check your wrist. Just listen for the distinctive cries, the booming voice selling baked goods, the rhythmic chant of the coal merchant. They won't tell you the exact minute, but they'll give you something perhaps more authentic: the living, breathing, flexible pulse of 18th century London, a city where time wasn't owned by clocks, but lived by the people. We've explored the noisy chaos of London's streets, the grand chimes of its churches, and the whispered luxury of private clocks. But beyond all these human attempts to wrangle time, there existed a far more ancient, far more universal timekeeper, one that dictated the very rhythm of life for every Londoner, rich or poor, the inexorable cycle of natural light. Before the pervasive glow of electric street lamps or the endless scroll of social media, your daily schedule was literally written in the sky. Imagine waking up, no alarm clock, no blaring phone. Your internal clock, attuned to generations of natural rhythms, stirs you as the first hints of gray light bleed through your window. You don't need a bell to tell you it's dawn. You feel the subtle shift in the air, the gradual brightening, the awakening of the city around you. Mainstream historical fact. Before standardized artificial lighting and precise mechanical timekeeping became common, human daily routines were overwhelmingly governed by the cycles of natural light and darkness. Work began at sunrise, paused for meals, and generally concluded with the setting of the sun. You feel the slow, steady progress of the sun as it climbs higher. The shadows outside shorten, becoming crisp and sharp. At its zenith, high above the smog-laden rooftops, you recognize midday. This is the peak of the working day, the busiest hour for markets and merchants. You might stretch, grab a bite, and know that you're roughly halfway through your waking hours. It's a beautifully simple, undeniably analog system. Though, if you're trying to impress your boss with your punctuality, simply pointing to the sun and shrugging probably won't cut it in the 18th century either. As the afternoon progresses, the light softens, taking on a warmer golden hue. Shadows lengthen, stretching across cobblestones and casting long figures. This is the signal for dusk, the winding down of the day's activities. Shops begin to close, street vendors pack up their carts, and the city prepares for the relative quiet of night. Without widespread street lighting, traveling after dark was often dangerous and inefficient, making the approach of night a powerful deterrent to lingering out. This natural rhythm, however, came with a huge, undeniable catch: seasonal variation. Our quirky tidbit for this section delves into the inherent flexibility of their hours. In the depths of winter, with its short, gloomy days, the period of daylight was drastically compressed. Your working day might be as short as 8 hours, while in the height of summer, with glorious, long evenings, it could easily stretch to 16 hours or more. This meant that the actual length of an hour, in terms of activity and work, wasn't a fixed 60 minutes. It was a fluid concept dictated by the sun's position. Imagine trying to explain that to someone today. Oh yes, we're meeting in 2 hours, but it's summer. So that's like really long hours, you know. It was less about precise time and more about making the most of the available light. So, your daily routine wasn't rigidly fixed to numerical hours, but expanded and contracted with the seasons. Farmers would rise earlier in spring, maximizing planting time, and work longer into the summer evenings for harvest. City workers might find their hours cut short in winter, relying on the brief, precious hours of daylight to accomplish their tasks. This profound connection to the sun meant a very different lived experience of time than our own. You were far more attuned to the subtle shifts of the natural world. The evening was for rest, for family, for the glow of the fireplace, or the flickering light of candles and oil lamps, which were expensive commodities. These artificial lights could extend the day, allowing for reading, social gatherings, or continued craft work, but they were a luxury, not a universal given. They cast long, dancing shadows, creating a different kind of temporal atmosphere, one where the boundaries of the day were softly blurred at its edges. Historians still debate the psychological impact of living by such a fluid, seasonally dictated sense of time on individuals. Did it foster a greater sense of well-being, reducing the stress of rigid schedules, or did it lead to uncertainty and inefficiency? It's likely that for many, it was simply the accepted reality, an unquestioned aspect of life. You lived by the sun, because the sun was the ultimate, inescapable clock, and its shifting patterns dictated everything from your work hours to your social engagements. So, as the light in your own room softly dims, and the world outside prepares for sleep, imagine London in the 18th century, not a city of ticking clocks and digital displays, but a place where time was a sensory experience, the gradual brightening of dawn, the high glare of midday, the soft golden light of dusk, and the deep, encompassing darkness of night. It was a timeless flow, a rhythm as old as humanity itself, a gentle, natural guide for a bustling, unclocked metropolis. You've learned how the sun choreographed London's day, and how the very length of an hour stretched and shrank with the seasons. Now, let's consider what this wonderfully fuzzy concept of time meant for your social life. In our world, A meeting set for 3 p.m. means 3 p.m. You're expected to be there, probably 5 minutes early, or risk a passive-aggressive text message or a stern glance. But in 18th century London, coordinating a social gathering or even a crucial business appointment was a much more relaxed affair, a charmingly imprecise social times fluid dance. Imagine trying to arrange a rendezvous with a friend at a bustling London coffee house. You couldn't just text, "Be there in 5." Your invitation might sound more like, "Meet me at Garraway's, if it pleases you, around midday, after the second bell." Perhaps, unless the fog lifts earlier. This wasn't because people were rude or disorganized. It was a pragmatic adaptation to a world where precise time was simply unavailable to the common person. Mainstream historical fact. Social and business appointments in 18th century London were indeed often set with much looser temporal specificity than today, accommodating the widespread lack of precise, synchronized timekeeping devices. Punctuality, as we understand it, was a developing concept, not a universal expectation. The inherent flexibility meant that a certain tolerance for tardiness was not just accepted, but expected. If you showed up precisely when you thought you were supposed to, you might find yourself waiting for quite some time, perhaps amusing yourself by people-watching, reading a newspaper, or just admiring the elaborate wig of the gentleman across the room. There was less stress about being on time, and more emphasis on simply being present. The value was in the connection, the conversation, the transaction, not the exact moment it began. It's like turning up for a party and the host saying, "Oh, you're early. People usually start showing up around whenever they get here." The quirky tidbit here is some of the delightful, archaic phrasing people would use to denote time, which further highlights this fluidity. Beyond midday or after the bells, you might hear invitations for candle lighting time, which meant dusk, or whenever it got dark enough to light candles. A flexible hour indeed, or afternoon bell, or even simply when the market closes. These were markers tied to events and natural light, not to the rigid divisions of a clock face. It was less about 3:47 p.m. and more about when the light is good enough to read by the window and you've finished your chores. No wonder they didn't need smartwatches telling them to stand up every hour. They were probably too busy adapting to time's natural whims. Meetings were often anchored by prominent landmarks rather than precise times. "Meet me by the entrance to St. Paul's Cathedral," or "I'll be at the sign of the Golden Lion Tavern." The landmark was the fixed point. The time of arrival was the variable. You'd find people arriving at these spots over a span of 30 minutes or an hour, patiently waiting for their acquaintances to appear. It was a societal expectation that you would wait, perhaps chat with passers-by, or grab a quick pint while doing so. This was less about impatience and more about the shared understanding that the world simply didn't run on exact minutes. Contrast this with our modern lives, where every minute is accounted for, every meeting scheduled on a digital calendar that sends insistent notifications. We live in a world of hyper-punctuality, where 5 minutes late can feel like a major transgression. The 18th century Londoner, by necessity, lived a less time-bound existence. Their social dance was more improvisational, a series of comfortable approximations and gentle adjustments. It wasn't that time didn't matter, it simply mattered differently. Historians still debate whether this fluid approach to time fostered stronger interpersonal connections, allowing for more spontaneous interaction and less stress, or whether it merely exacerbated daily inefficiencies and led to constant delays. Perhaps it was a bit of both. It certainly forced people to be more patient and adaptable, less reliant on external mechanisms, and more attuned to the rhythms of human interaction. You couldn't just send an email if someone didn't show up. You had to physically go and find them, or assume they'd arrive eventually. So, as you imagine yourself sipping a steaming cup of coffee in an 18th century London coffee house, waiting for a friend who might arrive in 5 minutes or 50, let that gentle, unhurried pace wash over you. There's no frantic checking of a clock, no stressed glances at a wrist. Just the murmur of conversation, the clinking of porcelain, and the fluid dance of time, moving at its own unclocked rhythm. It was a time when showing up was the real victory, and precisely when you showed up was merely a detail. You've experienced the leisurely flow of 18th century London's social calendar, where on time was more a suggestion than a strict command. But what about work? Surely a bustling metropolis, like the engine room of an empire, had its citizens on a strict, minute-by-minute schedule, right? Well, if you were part of the vast working populace, your day was probably less about punch clocks and more about, well, getting stuff done. For many Londoners, the rhythm of their toil was governed by task completion, not by the relentless tick-tock of a clock. Imagine you're an apprentice in a busy tailor's shop. You don't arrive at precisely 7 a.m. You arrive when the master expects you, which is usually when the light is sufficient to begin work. Mainstream historical fact. For many in 18th century London, work was primarily task-oriented, meaning compensation and daily rhythm were often tied to the completion of specific jobs. The production of a certain quantity of goods, or simply fulfilling the duties required for the day, rather than fixed hourly shifts. Your worth wasn't measured by the hours you sat at a bench, but by the number of garments you stitched, the amount of cloth you cut, or the errands you ran. It was like living in a perpetual state of gig economy, where your pay depended on finishing the delivery, not on how long you drove around. This focus on output rather than input meant that work hours could be incredibly flexible, or incredibly demanding, depending on the season, the master's temperament, and the amount of orders piled up. In the long summer days, work might stretch long into the evening, fueled by natural light. In the short, gloomy days of winter, the workday would shrink, limited by the expense of candles and oil lamps, or by sheer exhaustion. You worked until the task was finished, or until you literally couldn't see what you were doing anymore. No work-life balance consultants running workshops in this era? I can tell you that much. The quirky tidbit here is the phenomenon known as Saint Monday. Many artisans, especially those working independently or for masters who paid by piecework, famously took Monday off. Why? Because they often earned enough in the latter half of the week to enjoy a long weekend. This was an informal but widely observed form of self-regulation of their working hours, an act of autonomy in a demanding world. Imagine trying to explain that to your boss today. Yeah, I'm just observing Saint Monday. I'll get that report done. Eventually. You'd probably be observing unemployment by Tuesday. For domestic servants, time was dictated by the household's needs. The cook rose when the master desired breakfast. The scullery maid worked until the dishes were cleaned. The stable boy tended to the horses until they were properly fed and groomed. There was no end of shift as we know it, just an endless series of tasks that needed completing, often from before dawn until well after dark. Their days were a continuous flow of duties, punctuated by brief rest rather than discrete, time-bound segments. This task-based economy meant that the pressure wasn't on the clock, but on the finished product. A shoemaker wasn't paid for 8 hours of work. He was paid for a pair of shoes. A weaver wasn't paid by the minute. She was paid by the yard of cloth. This could foster immense pride in craftsmanship, as your livelihood directly depended on the quality and quantity of your output. It also meant that if you slacked off, or if your quality was poor, you simply didn't get paid, or you lost your clientele. It was a brutal but clear system of accountability. Historians still debate whether task-based work systems fostered greater craftsmanship and autonomy among workers, allowing them to control their own pace, or whether they ultimately led to exploitation and longer, less regulated working days for the benefit of masters and merchants. It's likely a complex mix. For some, it might have offered a sense of freedom. For others, it likely meant grinding poverty unless they worked ceaselessly. The lack of a universal clock meant that the boundaries between work time and leisure time were much blurrier, often bleeding into each other. So, as you imagine the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the whir of the spinner's wheel, or the rhythmic scrubbing of a laundress by the Thames, remember that their days were not segmented by a chiming clock tower. They were defined by the weight of raw materials, the demands of a master, the needs of a customer, and the sheer physical effort required to bring a task to completion. Time was not an abstract number, but a tangible experience, tied to the very fabric of their labor. It was a more organic, human pace, perhaps less efficient by modern standards, but certainly a far cry from the scheduled, digital exactitude we live by today. You've meandered through the task-based schedules of London's artisans and the fluid social time of its coffeehouses. These were worlds where minutes mattered less than moments. But now, let's leave the relatively cozy, if chaotic, streets of London for a moment and consider a domain where the precise measurement of time wasn't just a matter of convenience or status, but of life and death, empire and ruin, the vast, unforgiving expanses of the open sea. Here, time transformed from a gentle rhythm into an absolute critical necessity, especially for solving the greatest navigational puzzle of the age. Imagine yourself on the deck of a mighty British warship, or perhaps a merchant vessel laden with valuable cargo, far from any sight of land. You know your latitude easily enough, you can use the sun at noon or the North Star at night to find your north-south position. It's like knowing your street address. But what about your east-west position? That's your longitude, and in the 18th century, finding it at sea was, to put it mildly, an absolute nightmare. Mainstream historical fact. In the 18th century, accurately determining longitude at sea was arguably the greatest unsolved scientific and navigational problem of the era. Hundreds of ships were lost, thousands of lives perished, and countless fortunes were swallowed by the waves because sailors simply didn't know how far east or west they were. It's like trying to find a specific house number in a vast, sprawling city when you know the street name, but you have no idea which block you're on, and there's a hurricane coming. The core problem was this. The Earth rotates. Every 15 degrees of longitude, the local time changes by 1 hour. So, if you knew the precise time back home, say, at a fixed point like Greenwich, England, and you also knew your precise local time, you could calculate the difference and thus your longitude. Simple, right? Except your local time was easy to find with a sundial or celestial observation. But knowing the precise time back home, thousands of miles away, on a pitching, rolling ship with no reliable clocks, that was the impossible part. This desperate need for accurate time at sea fueled a scientific and technological race of epic proportions. The stakes were enormous economic dominance, naval power, and the lives of entire crews. Ships would often sail for weeks or months, completely lost, running out of water and provisions, making landfall by sheer luck or the terrifying sight of a coastline they didn't recognize. The anxiety on board must have been crushing, a constant gnawing fear. It was like driving a self-driving car across a desert, only the GPS keeps cutting out, and you're pretty sure you saw a mirage of a giant, angry octopus back there. Early attempts to solve this longitude problem were, frankly, sometimes hilarious in their desperation. Astronomers pushed the idea of lunar distances, complex calculations based on the moon's position relative to stars, but these required clear skies, immense mathematical skill, and hours of tedious work on a wildly unstable ship. Not exactly practical for your average sailor on a stormy night. This brings us to our quirky tidbit. One truly bizarre proposal, though not widely adopted, involved the use of sympathetic powder or powder of sympathy. The idea was that if you applied this powder to a dog's wound, it would react at a fixed time back home, making the dog yelp. A ship at sea would have a wounded dog, and when it yelped, they'd know the exact time in London. No, I'm not making this up. The thought of an entire fleet of ships relying on a synchronized symphony of canine suffering for navigation is both darkly comical and utterly absurd. But it highlights the extreme lengths people were willing to go. Historians still debate whether the astronomical methods of calculating longitude, while theoretically sound, were ever truly practical for the average sailor in harsh sea conditions. The sheer complexity, the specialized instruments, and the need for clear weather made them more suitable for trained astronomers than for the day-to-day realities of life at sea. There was a desperate, undeniable need for something simpler, something more reliable, something that didn't involve complex equations or barking dogs. The stage was set for a hero, not a general or an explorer, but a humble clockmaker, to solve this seemingly intractable problem. The search for a reliable sea clock, a chronometer that could keep Greenwich time accurately for months on end, became the holy grail of 18th century science. The fate of nations, the success of trade, and the lives of countless sailors depended on it. London, with its burgeoning watchmaking industry, would become the epicenter of this quest, a quest that would ultimately lead to the standardization of time, not just at sea, but eventually on land. You've felt the terror of being lost at sea, where even the most seasoned sailor couldn't tell you if you were off the coast of Ireland or halfway to Nova Scotia. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was an economic disaster and a national humiliation for maritime powers like Britain. Ships laden with precious cargo vanished, naval fleets struggled to rendezvous, and the cost in lives and treasure was staggering. The solution, everyone agreed, was more accurate timekeeping. But how do you get precision in a world of wobbly sundials and out-of-sync bells? The answer, for Britain, came from the halls of power, in a grand, audacious, and slightly bureaucratic quest for a solution, the Longitude Act of 1714. Imagine the hushed urgency in the British Parliament. Tales of shipwrecks and lost fortunes echoed through the chambers. The nation's very prosperity, its naval supremacy, depended on solving this seemingly impossible puzzle. Mainstream historical fact, recognizing the critical national importance of accurate navigation. The British Parliament passed the Longitude Act in 1714. This landmark legislation offered an enormous financial reward, a staggering $20,000, an amount equivalent to many millions in today's money, enough to buy a small fleet, or perhaps a particularly fancy London borough, to anyone who could devise a practical and precise method for determining longitude at sea. It was the ultimate governmental bounty, a challenge thrown down to the brightest minds and the most ingenious inventors of the age. Forget your modern tech challenges. This was the original, with far higher stakes and no venture capitalists in sight. To oversee this grand quest, the Act established the Board of Longitude. This was a formidable body, initially dominated by eminent astronomers, mathematicians, and naval officers. Their mission to evaluate all proposed solutions and award the coveted prize. You can imagine the scene: a room filled with stern, wigged gentlemen poring over complex charts and scrutinizing bizarre inventions while nervously sipping tea. Their criteria were incredibly strict. The method had to be accurate enough to determine longitude within half a degree on a voyage to the West Indies, representing a precision that seemed almost impossible to achieve on a constantly moving ship. From the outset, two main approaches emerged as the primary contenders, setting the stage for a fascinating intellectual battle. On one side were the astronomers, the intellectual heavyweights who largely favored the lunar distance method. This involved precisely measuring the moon's position relative to certain stars, then comparing those observations to tables predicting the moon's future movements. It was mathematically elegant, theoretically sound, and relied on celestial mechanics, which was their domain. The problem: it was incredibly complex, required clear skies a rarity in the North Atlantic, and hours of tedious calculations performed by a skilled navigator on a pitching, rolling deck. It's like trying to solve a complicated Sudoku puzzle during a roller coaster ride. On the other side, often dismissed by the academic elite as an impractical fantasy, was the idea of the chronometric method, simply building a clock so accurate it could keep perfect Greenwich time for months on end at sea. Imagine a clock that could withstand the salt, the damp, the constant motion, and the changes in temperature, all while ticking away with unwavering precision. It seemed impossible. Traditional clocks, even the best ones that were far too sensitive and unreliable. This particular quest attracted a different breed of genius, the practical, often self-taught artisan. This brings us to a crucial quirky tidbit. The inherent bias and skepticism of the Board of Longitude, particularly towards mechanical solutions. Many of the esteemed astronomers on the board believed that only celestial phenomena could provide a reliable, long-term solution. They simply could not fathom that a mere machine, a creation of springs and gears, could possibly be more accurate than the predictable, unchanging movements of the heavens. It was like a medieval astrologer dismissing GPS because it didn't involve reading the stars. This bias created an uphill battle for anyone proposing a mechanical timekeeping device, fostering years of political intrigue, personal rivalries, and endless debate. Historians still debate the extent to which the Board of Longitude was genuinely open to innovative solutions versus being biased towards established scientific methods and their own academic comfort zones. Was their skepticism justified given the state of clockmaking at the time? Or did it needlessly delay the adoption of the most practical solution? This tension between theoretical science and practical engineering would define the quest for longitude for decades. You can almost hear the ticking of various experimental clocks in the background of your mind, each one a hopeful, mechanical whisper of a solution. The Longitude Act wasn't just a prize. It was a powerful catalyst that galvanized a generation of inventors, astronomers, and craftsmen, forcing them to confront the very limits of human knowledge and technological capability. It transformed the problem of telling time at sea into a grand national obsession, a scientific and engineering challenge that would ultimately lead to some of the most groundbreaking advancements in timekeeping, fundamentally changing how London, and indeed the world, understood and measured time. You've witnessed Parliament's desperate gamble, offering a king's ransom to whoever could unlock the secrets of longitude. This massive prize, the Longitude Act, wasn't just about money. It was about national pride, global dominance, and saving lives. But for this grand quest to even begin, there needed to be a central, undisputed source of truth, a place from which all time, all celestial observations, and ultimately all accurate navigation would flow. That place was, and remains, Greenwich. Imagine yourself ascending a quiet hill overlooking the winding River Thames, just a few miles east of the bustling heart of London. Here, surrounded by meticulously kept grounds, stands a modest yet profoundly significant building, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Mainstream historical fact. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich was established in 1675, decades before the Longitude Act, specifically with the primary purpose of improving navigation by mapping the stars and planets with unparalleled accuracy. While its initial focus was on providing celestial data for the lunar distance method, it quickly became the de facto reference point for accurate time in Britain. It was essentially the world's first dedicated scientific research institution for global navigation, decades before its time. Literally, the Astronomer Royal, the head of the observatory, was tasked not with setting clocks, but with observing the heavens. His domain was the vast, glittering expanse of the night sky. By meticulously charting the positions of stars and the movements of the moon and planets, he was creating the celestial maps that navigators desperately needed. But in doing so, he also, by necessity, had to keep incredibly accurate local time. Every observation, every calculation, depended on knowing the precise moment it was made. And that precise moment, right there in Greenwich, eventually became the standard against which all other times would be measured. The quirky tidbit here is that the Astronomer Royal's initial job description was less about broadcasting time and more about finding longitude through the stars. He wasn't appointed to be a clock setter-in-chief for the nation. He was a cosmic cartographer. It was almost accidental that his location and meticulous timekeeping for astronomical purposes became the ultimate temporal benchmark. It's like being hired to organize a pantry and then accidentally inventing a global food distribution network. Well, I was just cataloging the spices, but now everyone wants to know what time my nutmeg arrived. So, how did this precise time, kept diligently within the observatory's walls, reach the rest of London and, eventually, the world? In the 18th century, there were no synchronized radio signals or atomic clocks. Initially, It involved a rather charmingly low-tech approach. People would simply visit the observatory. Watchmakers, navigators, and curious individuals would come to Greenwich with their own instruments. Carefully compare them to the observatory's master clock, which was itself calibrated by astronomical observations, and then scurry back to their shops or ships, carrying the precious accurate Greenwich time with them. It was a bit like downloading an update manually, but instead of a file, you were downloading a precise moment in time into your pocket watch. This marked a crucial shift in mindset. Time was no longer a fluid concept, subject to the whims of sundials, distant bells, or sleepy watchmen. It was becoming a centralized, authoritative standard, originating from a single scientifically managed point. While the ubiquitous public clocks we know today wouldn't fully emerge until later, the idea of a single, correct time was firmly taking root, thanks to the undeniable needs of maritime navigation. This growing awareness of a national time standard would slowly begin to ripple through London society. Historians still debate the precise mechanisms and frequency by which private clocks and public bells in London were initially synchronized with Greenwich time in the absence of electronic signals. Was it truly enough for a few watchmakers to visit, or did the accuracy of their products slowly force a gradual convergence across the city? It was a complex, organic process, far from the instant synchronization we experience today. But the seed of standardization had been planted, slowly transforming London from a city of many times into a city marching, however imperfectly, to a single national beat. You can almost feel the cold precision of the observatory, the quiet hum of its instruments, patiently observing the stars. It was here, in this unassuming place, that the future of time itself was being forged, one meticulous observation and one precisely timed tick at a time. The echoes of those early days at Greenwich still resonate. Every time you glance at a clock, anywhere in the world, and see a common hour, you've witnessed the ancient sun, the cacophonous bells, the elusive pocket watches, and the tireless pursuit of accuracy at Greenwich. But all these individual efforts, all these disparate attempts to pin down time, were slowly converging towards a single, grand, public solution. The stage was set for time to finally step out from the shadows of private homes and church steeples and claim its rightful visible place on the streets of London. This was the gradual, yet ultimately unstoppable rise of the public clock. Imagine standing in a bustling London square in the early 19th century. Instead of straining to hear a distant bell or peering at a smudged sundial, you glance up. There, high on a prominent building, or perhaps a newly erected tower, stands a magnificent clock face. Its hands are crisp, its numerals clear, and when it strikes the hour, it does so with a powerful, authoritative boom that leaves no room for doubt. Mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw a significant increase in the construction of prominent public clocks across London and other industrializing cities. Driven by the growing need for synchronized schedules in a society increasingly structured by factories, public transport, and formalized commerce. This wasn't just about showing off, it was about organizing. These new public clocks, often paid for by wealthy benefactors, local parishes or municipal funds, were far more accurate than their predecessors. They were often connected to the Greenwich Standard, either directly or through watchmakers who regularly calibrated them. Their very presence began to subtly, yet profoundly, reshape the daily lives of Londoners. No longer could you rely on around midday or when the market closes. Now you had a single, universally recognized time. Synchronize your watches became less a spy movie trope and more a daily reality, though far less dramatic. The quirky tidbit here is that these public clocks quickly became gathering points. People with their new, yet still often inaccurate, pocket watches would literally gather beneath the gleaming faces of these prominent public clocks to set their own timepieces with reassuring precision. Imagine the scene: a crowd of gentlemen, laborers, and merchants, all peering up, comparing their watches, and then carefully adjusting the hands, ensuring they were finally on time with the official standard. It was a beautiful, collective act of temporal alignment, making sure everyone was on the same page, or at least the same minute. It was like everyone downloading the latest software update for their internal operating system, all at once. And for the first time, you lost your best excuse for being late to a meeting. The impact of this newfound standardization rippled through every aspect of London life. Work shifts and burgeoning factories could now be precisely scheduled, leading to greater efficiency, but also a more rigid control over workers' time. Public transport, like the expanding omnibus services and, later, the railways, could operate on precise timetables, enabling a level of coordination previously impossible. Suddenly, missing a train meant more than just a slight inconvenience. It meant being late. Time became a commodity, a measurable unit, something that could be gained or lost, rather than simply experienced. This wasn't just a technological upgrade, it was a societal transformation. The organic, task-based rhythms of the street vendors and laborers slowly gave way to the relentless tick-tock of the clock. Life became more regulated, more precise, more ordered. The church bells continued to chime, but their role as primary timekeepers diminished, becoming more of a comforting echo than a precise command. Sundials became decorative curiosities, their shadows charming, but utterly useless for modern punctuality. Historians still debate the extent to which the new clock time was liberating, creating efficiency and opportunities versus a more restrictive imposition on people's natural rhythms, forcing them into unnatural schedules. Was it progress or a subtle loss of human connection to the flow of the day? It's likely both. It certainly created the modern world we inhabit, a world obsessed with minutes and seconds, with deadlines and schedules, all thanks to those magnificent, booming public timekeepers. So, as you feel the quiet hum of your own personal time-telling device, perhaps your phone or a smart clock, remember the journey London took, from the sun's shadow to the watchman's cry, from the private tick of a pocket watch to the grand, unifying strike of a public clock. London learned to tell time, and in doing so, it changed forever, ushering in an era where time became a shared, precise, and utterly unavoidable part of daily life. The great clock of history now winds down, its final gentle tick echoing softly into the quiet of your room. You've journeyed through the bustling, unclocked streets of 18th century London, felt the shifting shadows of sundials, and heard the resonant, if often out of sync, chimes of 100 church bells. You've glimpsed the meticulous hands of the watchmaker, the fluid rhythm of the street vendor, and the cosmic precision sought at Greenwich. Allow these images to softly dissolve, like mist over the Thames, the clamor of the city, the ticking of gears, the distant shouts of watchmen. They all blend into a single, soothing hum. You are no longer navigating by uncertain markers, but drifting gently into the vast, timeless ocean of slumber. Let the concept of precise minutes and seconds, of appointments and schedules, simply float away. There's no need for them now. Breathe deeply, feel the stillness, and let your own internal clock settle into a peaceful, unhurried rhythm. The day's demands have faded. The need to know the exact hour has vanished. You are safe, you are warm, and the only time that matters now is the endless, calming stretch of peaceful sleep. Just rest. Sweet dreams.